Ha, ha.
Shields and swords, feel the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hello students and minions. So, this is a mini lecture for one of my courses, but also because so many people have asked me lately about having more netcasts for Professor Awesome and the Minions of Doom, I've decided to sort of make this dual purpose. And so I'm going to be essentially today giving a introduction to Homer's The Odyssey. And this introduction is not meant to cause you to have a complete understanding of everything, but is instead to be supplemental to what I talk about in my classes, and also, I hope, for the Minions of Doom out there, to encourage those of you who've always thought, well, maybe I should read this, I've heard of the Odyssey, maybe I should read it, that it might be worth reading. So the first thing I want to talk about with the Odyssey is the structure of the Odyssey. It's often intimidating to people when they first begin because it isn't clear exactly what's going on, and the reason for that is that there isn't a kind of straightforward beginning to end structure. Instead, most of it is told through flashback, characters recounting things which have already happened in the past, and also there is this second storyline involving Telemachus, the son of Odysseus. And so if you've come to the Odyssey and you're thinking, oh, this is about Odysseus, and then you read several books, and Odysseus is already is missing and presumed dead, and it's all about this Telemachus kid, and you're thinking, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And so the structure of the Odyssey basically is first the kind of story of Telemachus. His father's been missing for many years, and he kind of embarks on this little mini quest to go find his father. And in the end, he does find him, though not where he went to look for him. What he doesn't know is that simultaneous to that, his father, as we find out later, is also embarking on a quest to return home. And so essentially, the timeline is you have the Trojan War, then you have Odysseus returning home, Odysseus attempting to return home and not succeeding at returning home, and then spending some years on Calypso's island, and then again deciding to return home, and then that's a pretty short voyage back. And then he meets up with Telemachus, and then the story comes to its kind of climactic end. But in terms of the narrative, the way that it happens is you begin with Telemachus, and you have no idea what's going on with Odysseus. And then you come to Odysseus, and Odysseus, we're years after the end of the Trojan War, and Odysseus is just sort of like staring out at sea and wishing he could go home. And then finally he's able to go home, and he stops on an island along the way, and he kind of recounts the adventures that he had before, many with monsters and all sorts of exciting stories that you might have known about. So if you enter into this and you're thinking this is going to be very simple, first A, then B, then C, then D, then E happens, that's not the way it's going to work. It's structured a little bit more maybe like you would think certain kinds of movie, like sometimes Tarantino will like to have sort of interweaving storylines. It's not, where something is told mostly by flashback, and so you reach the end of the story, sort of you're kind of at near the end of the story at the beginning of the story. And this is essentially the way that the story comes to us. So then, why start this book about Odysseus with Telemachus? And not just a little like Telemachus, like, oh, I wish I knew where my father was, but alas, I don't. But in fact, it goes on and on for several books of it with his story. And it kind of almost appears that there won't be a story about Odysseus. That's because ultimately the Odyssey has a lot, it's complicated. There are a lot of elements to it, so I don't want to be too reductive. But in many ways, it's a coming-of-age story. It's about what does it mean to be a grown-up. It focuses way more on what it means to be a man than what it means to be a grown woman, but we do also have the idea of what it means to be a grown woman in there as well. And coming-of-age stories are super common and super popular in literature, folklore, and normally what happens is there's a situation where the hero or heroines, their parent is gone. Maybe they're dead, maybe they're missing. Often they've been replaced by a step-parent or a parent surrogate who's not a good parent, and they have to learn how to be a grown-up, often with the inspiration of what their missing parent was like and what their missing parent would have wanted. A good example that might be appropriate for the age of many of my students is the Lion King. In the Lion King, you have this cub who does not understand. He doesn't understand really what it means to be a grown up. He thinks it means bossing people around. He loses his father, and his father is then replaced by his uncle, who is a kind of evil version of his father. He goes into exile, ends up with a couple of friends who don't exactly help him grow up. They really keep him in a state of arrested development where he just sort of floats along aimlessly. Eventually he returns, has to defeat the false father, and come into his own as king. And in that time there are, of course, various other elements. And Lion King is just one of many, many examples of this. In fairy tales, for example, you often have in fairy tales, especially for girls coming of age stories, the wicked stepmother and the fairy godmother. And so you will have the mother is gone, and then it's kind of split into a bad mother and a good mother, and the bad mother is trying to hurt the daughter or prevent her from growing, and the good mother is trying to help her grow in some way. So the coming of age stories are not, the Odyssey is not even close to the only one. There are lots and lots and lots of these, everything from that to Spider-Man, to all sorts of other stories. So ultimately what we see at the beginning of this story is Telemachus, he's trying to figure out, he's kind of grown into the point of manhood, and his house has been overrun by these suitors who are the kind of bad version of manhood. They just want to consume and take and use people. And ultimately what he has to do is go on this quest to find out what kind of man his father is. And once he's done that, in fact, even if he doesn't meet his father, he will return more of the kind of man that he should be. The suitors are kind of non-men, men who never grew up, who never became what they were supposed to be. His father represents the sort of ideal that he's supposed to achieve. But there are other men in this. One of the things that Telemachus does at the very beginning is he kind of goes out to see his father's old friends from the Trojan War. These are men. These are men who grew into manhood, who made mistakes, for sure, but they grew into what they were supposed to be, and are sort of giving examples through describing his father of what kind of man Telemachus should be. We have them throughout the story of Odysseus represented by the crew. Odysseus' crew is not ideal. They are certainly flawed men, but they are the men who fought the Trojan War. They will all, as they make mistakes, they will suffer for those mistakes and eventually be killed, or various other things will happen to them. But they will, they're a better example of manhood than the suitors. And for women, we have the kind of ideal of Penelope, Odysseus' wife. Now, the problem with Penelope for this is that she's in mourning for 95% of the story, and most of the time she spends really in depression. But in that, we do manage to see how she uses the the position she has as a woman to be able to use her guile to make the right things happen. Now, in the end, she's being forced to marry one of these guys, but she can delay it. She can do all sorts of things to do that in a way that is appropriate to their culture. So she uses things like her responsibility to her father-in-law, Odysseus's father, her her other sorts of responsibilities, sort of push this off as far as possible. And we see her as a sort of ideal. The younger version, of course, is a minor character, someone named Nausicaa, who has a very short storyline, but we see Nausicaa as coming into womanhood. And her story is not so much about, at first, what kind of woman she needs to be, but what kind of man, now that she's a woman, what kind of man to look for. And in that, we see the example of Odysseus washes up on her shore as a kind of ideal man who is not going to claim her, but is instead going to behave respectfully toward her no matter what. And she kind of learns through his example that a kind of sense of, no, I shouldn't just take literally the first man who washes up on shore, and I shouldn't just, I am worthy of respecting myself more than that. So in this structure, we have all this kind of coming of age story, and for the average reader, a real sense of what does it take to be a grown-up? What does it take to be a grown man or grown woman? And of course, within that, you get this played out in a story that has all sorts of monsters and fights and war and adventure and things like that. So this is, I think, why the Odyssey has endured over the centuries. So thanks for listening, Minions, and finish your reading, students.